The Republican National Committee has decided to end their efforts to reach out to minority voters. Founding to take over the RNC by Trump's allies, including his daughter-in-law, Laura, the organization looks like it's about to become Trump's legal slush fund, and therefore will not be needing all this other fancy stuff like outreach to minorities. Two people with knowledge of the plans characterize them as self-defeating, saying that this potentially erases gains with groups of new voters who may have soured on the Democratic Party. In fact, as one of the sources put it to the Daily Beast, the tagline might as well be, quote unquote, make the RNC white again. I mean, well, that would imply that at one point they were not just for white people. I mean, come on.
The Republican Party's racist.
It's pretty simple, okay? Now, the Messenger, before it shut down, reported back in January that the RNC had already shuttered most of its nearly 24 Hispanic community centers, leaving about 5 open. So that was the program, right? This was an initiative back from the 2022 midterms, where RNC field staff had engaged voters through gatherings and events held at community centers in areas with heavy minority populations, more specifically Latino communities. So it makes sense, right? You're trying to get the Latino vote. Hey, there are a lot of very conservative Latino, Americans. There's also very conservative African Americans. So it would make sense to reach out to those groups if you're trying to get their votes. It makes all the sense in the world. They do exist. These populations are not monoliths, okay? You just have to reach out to them with a message and, not be racist against them. But apparently, Republicans can't even put aside their racism or pretend to put aside their racism for like 2 freaking minutes, all right, in order to get their votes. Can't do it.
Can't let that happen.
Anyway, so now the RNC originally claimed that closures were temporary and planned to open 40 new similar centers. However, the program appears to be another casualty in the RNC's recent restructuring. According to the report, a purge that has been likened to a bloodbath. Yes, they have gotten rid of a lot of programs and a lot of staffers since Trump won the nomination and his allies have taken over the RNC. So what's their plan now? Well, instead of going after minority voters, Republicans are doubling down on old white people, which I'm sure will work out great in the long term. Now, here's the thing. Republicans are claiming that it was just too expensive to run these community centers. They just can't afford it right now, okay? It's too much money. We would love to reach out to, Latinos and African Americans, but we just can't. It's just, the money's just not there. Interesting. And also, not at all true. Okay. Now, most of the people familiar with the effort said that the overhead is the big cost, right? And that big cost would be related to renting space for the centers, along with staffing and incidentals. Okay, none of that's free, obviously. However, these people also said that the cost was minimal. And especially considering the possible gains electorally that you would get from reaching out to these communities. They were making inroads with these, minority conservative communities. FEC filings show that in 2022, the RNC actually spent a grand total of just $2 million on rent, with much of that going to campaigns and state and local parties for joint fieldwork in the midterms. Now, when you drill down to the numbers even further, you find that these community centers were actually not that expensive when it comes to a campaign. One of them, this is the No Limits Community Development in Georgia, the RNC paid just $3,500 per month to keep that open. Not a lot for an organization, right? Now, here's the thing. You know where their money is actually going? It's going to Donald Trump and his legal fees. For that same time, that $3,500 for that one community center, right? Compare that to the $1.6 million the RNC was using for Trump's legal fees. Yeah, and it gets even better, right? Because it turns out that the rent expenses came out of a different account. They came out of the party's building account, a specially segregated bank account that can only be tapped for expenses related to buildings and maintenance, which is not a part of their political money whatsoever. That tells me that they would rather use that money to fund Donald Trump's legal fees than put it into this separate account that they would use for outreach. Okay? They're shutting this down. And not only are they shutting it down for that reason, to be able to direct more money towards paying off Donald Trump's legal fees, they also want to double down on the Republicans' white grievance politics, as well as voter suppression. That the RNC, at the same time, has cut their mail-in voting efforts. That's right. The Washington Post reported that the RNC has cut the much-heralded Bank Your Vote program aimed at getting Republicans to vote early in elections, and will shift to a Grow the Vote program focused on expanding the party's outreach to less likely Trump voters. But apparently that does not involve minority communities. In addition, they report that RNC Chief Operating Officer Chris LaCivita is installing Christina Bobb, former OAN reporter who has espoused false claims that the 2020 election was stolen, as the Senior Counsel for Election Integrity. Yes, that's right. Someone who doesn't believe in election integrity being in charge of election integrity. Lovely. That's an election denier, okay? Appears to be a sign that Republicans are planning an all-out assault on voting rights, making it harder for people to get to the polls. Specifically, minority communities, which are more impacted by voter suppression laws than traditional Republican voters. In fact, Laura Trump has already said that they are planning to dump a massive amount of resources into their so-called election integrity division, which again is basically a lot of it's going to go into Christina Bobb's pockets. Let's be honest about that. Look, this is what they're doing. Instead of reaching out to minority communities for their votes, the RNC is doubling down on preventing these groups from voting at all and using whatever money they can to pay off Donald Trump's legal fees. That's it. I mean, when it comes down to it, long term, Trump may be the one person who ultimately brings down the Republican Party, because when you look at the long term, and the demographic shifts and changes that are coming in this country, it's not looking good for the Republican Party. That's why after every election that they lose, they're like, oh man, we really got to do a post-mortem here. And every time they do that, like in 2012, for example, like, man, we got to reach out to minority voters. We really got to reach out to those minority voters, There are conservatives. We can reach out to them. We can get them. We can court them on our side. Like, even Donald Trump has done way better with Hispanics than Republicans have previously done. They could capitalize on that and start getting some electoral wins. But instead, they're not going to do that. They're not going in that direction. They are obliterating themselves as we speak in order to help fund and appease a con man and a criminal by reaching out to racists.